The cafeteria at Willow Creek Elementary buzzed with the innocent chaos of Monday lunch hour when everything changed in an instant that would define the thin line between miracle and tragedy. Officer Jake Monroe watched his German Shepherd partner Shadow perform what seemed like routine community outreach, demonstrating canine skills to wide-eyed third graders who erupted in applause as the dog found a hidden key beneath gymnasium bleachers. The morning had unfolded exactly as planned until Shadow's head snapped up with predatory alertness that sent ice through Jake's veins. In that crystalline moment between normalcy and crisis, the dog's entire body transformed from relaxed companion to lethal guardian, his nose tracking something invisible to human senses through the maze of lunch tables where children sat obliviously spooning mac and cheese into their mouths. Shadow moved like a four-legged missile weaving between students, his powerful frame cutting through the cafeterias. Warm air thick with the comforting sense of melted cheese and childhood nostalgia, until he stopped dead at the serving counter, where fresh trays awaited distribution. The growl that emerged from his throat was prehistoric, primal, utterly foreign from the friendly dog who had been receiving high fives from kindergartners moments before. Every conversation died, every plastic spoon froze mid-air, every eye turned toward the magnificent animal whose instincts had just detected what would later be confirmed as an artificial compound capable of triggering fatal anaphylactic shock in children with nut allergies. But in that suspended moment, as Shadow positioned his body like a living barrier between danger and innocence, neither Jake nor the 100 people in that room understood they were witnessing the difference between a normal Monday and a mass casualty event that would have shattered families across the community forever. The silence stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap as Shadow's bark shattered the air with urgent warning that no human could have detected, but every soul in that room would never forget. 30 minutes after Shadow's warning bark had cleared the cafeteria, Officer Jake Monroe stood in the sealed kitchen watching hazmat specialists in white suits, meticulously examining the mac and cheese tray that had triggered his partner's unprecedented reaction. The dog remained positioned like a sentinel near the entrance, his dark eyes never leaving the contaminated serving area, as if he could still smell the invisible threat that had escaped every human sense in the room. Principal Dana Reynolds paced behind them, her hands trembling as she processed how close her school had come to an unthinkable disaster, while cafeteria worker Loretta Hines sat on a bench with tears streaming down her weathered face, clutching a tissue and whispering repeatedly that she should have known, should have seen the signs. The silence was broken only by the crackling radio communications between the hazmat team and the Department of Health, their clinical terminology creating a stark contrast to the cheerful lunch trays still sitting abandoned on tables throughout the empty cafeteria. Jake's phone buzzed with an incoming call from dispatch, and as he answered, the voice on the other end delivered news that would transform this incident from a near miss into a criminal investigation that would shake the entire community to its core. The food sample had tested positive for a concentrated allergen compound that had no business existing anywhere near a school kitchen, let alone being deliberately mixed into a meal destined for children's lunch trays. But the most chilling revelation was yet to come, as Jake's eyes met Loretta's across the room, and he saw in her expression not just guilt or fear, but the terrible knowledge of someone who had suspected something was wrong, but had chosen silence over action. The weight of that unspoken truth hung in the air like a loaded weapon, as Jake realized that Shadow's miraculous detection had prevented more than just accidental poisoning. It had exposed a deliberate act of sabotage that could have claimed multiple young lives, and somewhere in the community, the person responsible was still free, still dangerous, and possibly planning their next move against the most innocent and vulnerable members of society. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel Canine Loyal Souls, where we uncover true stories of animals' bravery you won't believe until you see it. And tell us in the comments, what city are you watching us from? In the heart of America's educational system, where yellow school buses carry our most precious cargo and cafeterias serve as gathering places for childhood memories, a silent threat lurks in the shadows that most parents never consider, and most schools are unprepared to face. This is the story of how one extraordinary German Shepherd named Shadow became the thin blue line between normalcy and nightmare, proving that heroism often comes on four legs and speaks in a language that transcends human understanding. Across the United States, over 50 million children enter school buildings every day, trusting that the adults around them will keep them safe, fed, and protected from harm. But what happens when that protection fails, when the very systems designed to nurture become weapons in the wrong hands, and when the only thing standing between children and catastrophe is the primal instinct of a canine officer who can smell danger where humans see only routine? Officer Jake Monroe had been partnered with Shadow for 3 years, responding to drug busts, tracking suspects through dense forests, and conducting routine school visits that were supposed to be nothing more than community outreach and educational demonstrations. Neither of them could have imagined that a simple Monday morning visit to Willow Creek Elementary would transform them from local law enforcement into national symbols of vigilance, intuition, and the unbreakable bond between human and canine that can literally mean the difference between life and death. This is not just another story about police dogs doing their jobs or children being kept safe at school. This is a deep dive into the psychology of prevention, the science of canine detection capabilities that surpass any human technology, and the terrifying reality that threats to our children can emerge from the most unexpected sources, often hiding in plain sight among the people we trust most. As we explore the events that unfolded at Willow Creek Elementary, you'll discover how one dog's bark created a ripple effect that changed school safety protocols across an entire state, exposed the dangerous gaps in background screening processes, and revealed the profound psychological factors that can transform ordinary individuals into threats against innocent children. The story begins on what seemed like the most ordinary Monday morning imaginable, in a small town where everyone knew everyone, where the biggest concerns were pop quizzes and playground disputes, and where no one could have predicted that lunch period would become the moment when everything changed forever. What makes this case particularly chilling is not just what happened, but what almost happened, and how close an entire community came to experiencing a tragedy that would have made national headlines for all the wrong reasons. The events we're about to explore will challenge everything you think you know about school safety, canine intelligence, and the invisible threats that can emerge from within the very institutions we trust to protect our children. This is the story of Shadow's bark that saved lives, and the investigation that followed, revealing a web of psychological trauma, failed systems, and the extraordinary power of animal instinct to detect evil where human perception fails completely. The morning sun cast long golden fingers through the maple trees surrounding Willow Creek Elementary as Officer Jake Monroe pulled his patrol cruiser into the staff parking lot at exactly 8:15, the radio crackling softly with routine dispatch calls that painted a picture of another peaceful Monday in suburban America. Shadow sat alert in the passenger seat, his dark, intelligent eyes scanning the familiar environment where children's laughter already echoed from the playground and the comforting aroma of cafeteria breakfast bacon drifted through the crisp autumn air. Jake adjusted his partner's tactical harness, running his fingers through the German Shepherd's thick coat while mentally reviewing the presentation they'd given dozens of times before, never imagining that this particular visit would become the most important day of both their careers. Principal Dana Reynolds emerged from the side entrance with her characteristic warm smile, silver-streaked curls catching the morning light as she approached with the confident stride of someone who had dedicated over a decade to nurturing young minds and creating safe spaces for learning. The handshake between her and Jake carried the easy familiarity of professionals who understood that community policing meant building relationships, one school visit at a time, one demonstration that showed children that officers and their canine partners were protectors rather than threats to be feared. Shadow trotted ahead as they entered the building, his nose immediately cataloging the complex bouquet of institutional cleaning supplies, fresh construction paper, and the distinctive scent of hundreds of children who had passed through these hallways carrying their hopes, fears, and the innocent energy that makes elementary schools feel like sanctuaries of possibility. The morning routine unfolded with clockwork precision as Jake and Shadow made their way to the gymnasium where 3rd and 4th graders sat cross-legged on the polished floor, their faces bright with anticipation and the kind of genuine excitement that only comes from breaking the normal rhythm of math worksheets and spelling tests. Jake's presentation covered the fundamentals of K9 unit operations, explaining how Shadow had been trained from puppyhood to use his extraordinary senses in service of public safety, demonstrating the partnership between human and canine that represented thousands of hours of trust-building and specialized education. The children erupted in applause as Shadow performed flawlessly, sitting on command, tracking scent trails with laser focus, and finding the hidden key beneath the gymnasium bleachers with the kind of precision that seemed almost magical to young observers who had never witnessed professional police dog capabilities up close. By 11 o'clock, both Jake and Shadow had earned invitations to stay for lunch, an offer that Principal Reynolds extended with genuine warmth while explaining that Monday meant mac and cheese, the universally beloved comfort food that could turn any ordinary school day into something special worth remembering. The cafeteria buzzed with the controlled chaos of 300 elementary students navigating lunch trays through a maze of rectangular tables while Shadow lay contentedly at Jake's feet, occasionally lifting his massive head to accept gentle pets from brave kindergarteners who approached with the reverent awe reserved for meeting genuine heroes. The air was thick with the nostalgic comfort of institutional cooking, melted cheese and warm bread, mingling with the sounds of plastic silverware against lunch trays and the innocent chatter of children discussing everything from playground politics to weekend adventures with their families. Jake sat among the teachers at a corner table, sharing stories about Shadow's training while the dog dozed peacefully, his breathing steady and relaxed after a successful morning of demonstrations and the kind of positive attention that even the most professional canine officer secretly enjoyed receiving from admiring young fans. The normalcy of the moment was profound, representing exactly the kind of community connection that made school visits worthwhile, where law enforcement officers could be seen as helpers and protectors rather than figures to be feared or avoided. Then Shadow's head snapped up with an alertness so sudden and complete that Jake's conversation stopped mid-sentence, every instinct honed by years of partnership immediately recognizing that his dog had detected something that demanded immediate attention and investigation. The German Shepherd's entire body language transformed in the space of a heartbeat, muscles tensing beneath his dark coat as his nose lifted to catch scent molecules invisible to every human in the room, his ears pricking forward with the kind of focused intensity that preceded only the most serious discoveries. Shadow rose to his feet with deliberate purpose, moving away from Jake's table with the fluid grace of a predator who had locked onto a target, weaving between surprised students with an urgency that caused conversations to pause and heads to turn as the friendly demonstration dog suddenly became something far more serious and professional. His path led directly to the serving counter, where cafeteria workers continued their routine of placing fresh lunch trays for distribution, unaware that they were about to become part of a life-saving intervention that would prevent a tragedy none of them could have imagined in their worst nightmares. The growl that emerged from Shadow's throat was unlike anything the children had heard during the morning's cheerful demonstrations, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere primal and ancient, cutting through the cafeteria's ambient noise like a blade and causing an immediate silence that felt heavy with unspoken danger. Every plastic spoon froze in mid-air, every conversation died instantly, and every pair of eyes in the room turned toward the magnificent animal whose instincts had just detected a threat that would later be confirmed as potentially fatal to multiple children sitting innocently at their lunch tables. Jake Monroe moved with the fluid precision of a veteran officer whose partner had just signaled imminent danger, his hand instinctively moving toward his radio while his eyes remained locked on Shadow's rigid posture beside the serving counter where innocent mac and cheese waited to be distributed to hungry children. The German Shepherd's behavior was unmistakable to anyone trained in canine operations, his body positioned protectively between the suspected threat and the cafeteria full of potential victims, every muscle fiber communicating urgent warning through a language that transcended human speech, but spoke directly to survival instincts buried deep in evolutionary memory. Principal Reynolds appeared at Jake's shoulder within seconds, her face pale with the growing realization that their peaceful Monday lunch period was rapidly transforming into something far more sinister than anyone could have anticipated when they'd welcomed a police dog demonstration into their school community. The cafeteria staff stood frozen in confusion and growing terror as Jake raised his voice with calm authority, directing teachers to move children toward the far end of the room, while Shadow maintained his vigil over the contaminated tray with the unwavering focus of a sentinel, guarding against invisible evil. Loretta Hines, the veteran cafeteria worker whose weathered hands had served thousands of meals to generations of Willow Creek students, stood trembling behind the counter with tears beginning to stream down her cheeks as the terrible truth of what her nephew had done began to crystallize in her mind like poison spreading through clear water. The serving spoon clattered to the floor from her shaking fingers as Jake approached with professional intensity, his questions cutting through her shock with surgical precision, while Shadow never wavered from his protective stance beside the tray that contained enough concentrated allergen to trigger fatal anaphylactic reactions in multiple children. The kitchen fell silent, except for the soft whimpering of a woman who had spent 20 years nurturing young lives, suddenly confronted with the horrifying reality that someone she loved and trusted had used her workplace as a weapon against innocent children whose only crime was sitting down to enjoy their favorite comfort food on an ordinary Monday afternoon. Jake's radio crackled to life as he called for hazmat specialists, his voice steady despite the growing understanding that they were potentially dealing with deliberate food tampering that could have resulted in multiple child fatalities, if not for Shadow's extraordinary detection capabilities and unwavering protective instincts. The dog remained motionless beside the tray, his dark eyes never leaving the contaminated food, while his presence served as both early warning system and last line of defense between calculated evil and elementary school innocence that trusted adults to keep them safe from harm they couldn't possibly understand or anticipate. Within 30 minutes, the cafeteria had been sealed off like a crime scene, while hazmat specialists in pristine white suits methodically collected samples from the tray that Shadow continued to guard with unwavering vigilance, his canine instincts providing better protection than any human security system could have offered the hundreds of children who had come dangerously close to consuming poison disguised as comfort food. Loretta Hines sat on a plastic chair in the school office, her hands twisted together like broken prayer beads, while tears carved deep channels through makeup she'd applied hours earlier when her biggest concern was whether there would be enough chocolate milk for the fifth-grade classes, who always seemed to drink more than expected. Principal Reynolds paced behind her desk, cell phone pressed to her ear as she coordinated with district officials and parents who would need to be notified that their children's school had just experienced a potential mass casualty event prevented only by the miraculous intervention of a police dog whose senses operated on levels that human technology couldn't match or replicate. The silence in the office was broken only by Loretta's whispered confessions about her nephew Tyler, a 19-year-old college dropout who had been living with her for 6 months after his father disappeared into the cycle of addiction and incarceration that had already claimed too many members of their family. She described a young man who had grown increasingly isolated and resentful, spending hours staring out the kitchen window at children playing during recess, with an expression that she now realized had been calculating rather than merely sad or nostalgic for his own lost childhood innocence. The temporary employment agency had cleared Tyler for cafeteria work based on basic background checks that revealed nothing about his growing psychological instability or his dangerous obsession with making people understand what it felt like to be invisible, overlooked, and systematically ignored by a society that seemed to value some lives more than others. Loretta's voice cracked as she admitted to noticing missing ingredients, finding refrigerator doors left open, and discovering Tyler standing motionless in the storage room, holding packets of food additives, while wearing an expression that should have triggered immediate intervention, but instead had been dismissed as typical teenage moodiness that would eventually resolve itself through patience and understanding. The weight of her silence pressed down on the office like accumulated guilt given physical form, each missed warning sign becoming another link in a chain of preventable tragedy that had been broken only by Shadow's extraordinary ability to detect malevolent intent through scent molecules that carried emotional residue human noses couldn't perceive. Jake Monroe's patrol cruiser cut through the quiet suburban streets toward the Hines residence, while Shadow sat alert in the passenger seat, his dark eyes scanning the neighborhood where modest ranch houses sat behind chain-link fences and weathered mailboxes told stories of working-class families struggling to maintain dignity in an economy that seemed designed to crush their dreams beneath the weight of endless bills and disappearing opportunities. The address led them to a single-story home with peeling paint and a driveway cracked by years of harsh winters, its appearance reflecting the kind of gradual decay that happens when hope becomes too expensive to maintain and survival requires every available dollar. Jake's trained eye immediately catalogued potential escape routes and tactical considerations, while Shadow's nose twitched with recognition of sense that painted an invisible picture of the psychological landscape they were about to enter, where desperation and resentment had fermented into something dangerous enough to threaten innocent children. The front door yielded no response to Jake's authoritative knocking, but Shadow's low growl indicated that their target was indeed present somewhere within the house, probably aware of their arrival and calculating whether flight or surrender offered better odds, avoiding the consequences that had been building toward this moment for months. They circled toward the backyard, through a gate hanging by one hinge, stepping carefully through neglected landscaping, where dead leaves crunched underfoot like broken promises, while Shadow's body language communicated increasing tension as they approached the sliding glass door that offered a view into the house's dim interior. Tyler Hines sat cross-legged on the living room floor, like a meditation gone wrong, headphones covering his ears while he stared at a television screen that remained dark and lifeless, reflecting back only his own pale face and the haunted expression of someone who had finally gone too far to retreat from the consequences of his actions. On the coffee table before him sat an open lunch tray identical to those used at Willow Creek Elementary, its contents arranged with the careful precision of someone recreating a crime scene, or perhaps trying to understand what he had almost accomplished through his calculated act of revenge against a world that had made him feel invisible. Jake tapped the glass with measured authority, while Shadow positioned himself strategically, ready to respond if their suspect attempted to flee or escalate the situation into something more dangerous than the calculated food tampering that had already crossed every line between frustrated anger and criminal assault against defenseless children. The sliding door opened easily under Jake's touch, revealing that Tyler had been waiting for this moment, with the resigned acceptance of someone who understood that his actions had finally attracted the attention he had craved, though not in the way he had imagined when hatred first began poisoning his judgment and transforming legitimate pain into something monstrous. Tyler Hines looked up from his position on the floor with eyes that held the hollow emptiness of someone who had crossed a moral boundary so fundamental that returning to innocence was no longer possible, his pale face reflecting months of accumulated resentment that had finally found expression in an act so calculated and cruel that it defied comprehension from anyone who hadn't experienced the particular brand of psychological isolation that transforms ordinary pain into something actively dangerous. Jake stepped carefully into the living room, while Shadow maintained a protective stance near the entrance, both officer and canine partner reading the complex, emotional atmosphere that surrounded their suspect like toxic fog, heavy with unspoken rage and the bitter satisfaction of someone who had finally forced the world to acknowledge his existence through an act of potential mass destruction. The confession came in broken fragments, Tyler's voice barely above a whisper, as he described the months of watching children through the kitchen window during his shifts, seeing their easy laughter and casual friendships while he remained invisible behind the serving counter, just another faceless employee whose name no one bothered to learn and whose presence registered only when something went wrong with their meal service. His hands trembled as he explained the online purchase of concentrated allergen powder, describing the research he had conducted into anaphylactic shock and the careful calculation required to create a dose that would cause maximum chaos without necessarily resulting in immediate death, though he admitted with chilling honesty that he hadn't particularly cared whether children survived his lesson about suffering and powerlessness. The lunch tray on his coffee table represented a grotesque monument to his crime, arranged with the meticulous attention to detail that suggested he had been rehearsing this moment of confession, preparing to explain his actions to authorities who would finally be forced to listen to someone they had previously dismissed as irrelevant background noise in their comfortable lives. Jake listened without judgment while documenting every word for the investigation that would follow, understanding that Tyler's motivation represented something far more complex than simple evil, rooted instead in the psychological devastation that occurs when isolation becomes so complete that causing pain seems like the only way to prove one's existence matters to an indifferent universe. Shadow remained perfectly still throughout the confession, his canine instincts recognizing the fundamental brokenness in Tyler's emotional state, while maintaining the protective alertness that had saved multiple young lives earlier that day. through nothing more complex than trusting what his nose told him about the intention behind contaminated food. The arrest proceeded without incident, as Tyler Hines submitted to handcuffs with the passive compliance of someone who had finally reached the end of a psychological journey that began with legitimate pain but had twisted into something unrecognizable and monstrous through months of isolation and festering resentment that had found its ultimate expression in calculated violence against innocent children. Jake's investigation expanded beyond the immediate crime scene as forensic specialists combed through Tyler's room, discovering a disturbing collection of online research into food allergies, anaphylactic shock symptoms, and detailed floor plans of Willow Creek Elementary that he had somehow obtained during his employment with the catering service that supplied temporary cafeteria workers to multiple school districts throughout the region. The digital trail painted a picture of methodical planning that had begun weeks before the actual poisoning attempt, with Tyler spending hours researching which children at the school had documented food allergies and calculating the precise dosage needed to trigger reactions severe enough to cause panic without necessarily resulting in immediate fatalities that might have complicated his message about powerlessness and suffering. Shadow accompanied Jake through every phase of the evidence collection process, his extraordinary senses providing confirmation that contaminated materials were present in Tyler's bedroom, kitchen, and even his clothing, creating an invisible map of criminal preparation that human investigators could never have detected without the German Shepherd's specialized training and natural abilities. The psychological evaluation that followed Tyler's arrest revealed a complex web of family dysfunction, educational failure, and social isolation that had created the perfect conditions for transformation from victim to perpetrator, though mental health professionals were careful to emphasize that millions of people experience similar trauma without resorting to acts of calculated violence against innocent targets who bore no responsibility for their suffering. Loretta Hines provided additional crucial information about her nephew's deteriorating mental state, describing instances where she had found him standing motionless in the school kitchen after hours, staring at empty lunch trays with an expression that she now recognized as the focused intensity of someone planning something terrible but lacking the knowledge or courage to intervene before his fantasies became deadly reality. The investigation also uncovered significant gaps in the background screening process used by temporary employment agencies, revealing that Tyler's psychological instability and growing obsession with revenge had never been detected by systems designed to protect vulnerable populations from individuals whose personal trauma had metastasized into active threats against community safety. District officials launched an immediate review of all temporary personnel who had access to food preparation areas, while Shadow's role in preventing the tragedy sparked discussions about expanding canine presence in schools beyond traditional drug detection and security functions to include regular wellness checks that could identify threats invisible to human perception. The news of Shadow's intervention spread through Willow Creek and beyond, like ripples from a stone thrown into still water, transforming a local incident into a national conversation about school safety, mental health screening, and the extraordinary capabilities of police dogs whose senses could detect threats that sophisticated human security systems completely missed. Parents who had dropped their children off that Monday morning, expecting nothing more eventful than arithmetic homework and playground disputes, found themselves confronting the terrifying reality that their elementary school had come within minutes of experiencing a mass casualty event that would have shattered families and haunted the community for generations. Principal Dana Reynolds held emergency meetings with district officials, mental health professionals, and law enforcement agencies as they struggled to process the implications of what had almost occurred within their supposedly safe educational environment, while also managing the delicate task of helping young students understand why their school had suddenly become the center of intense media attention and increased security protocols. The children themselves displayed remarkable resilience, with many expressing more concern for Shadow's well-being than their own safety, asking teachers whether the police dog was tired from his heroic work and requesting that he receive extra treats as reward for protecting them from danger they couldn't fully comprehend, but intuitively understood, had been very real and very close. Local news stations picked up the story within hours, followed by regional networks and eventually national media outlets that recognized the powerful narrative of a German shepherd whose instincts had prevented a tragedy that could have claimed multiple young lives and traumatized an entire community beyond repair. The coverage sparked broader discussions about the psychological factors that transform ordinary individuals into threats against innocent targets, with mental health advocates emphasizing the importance of early intervention and support systems that might have redirected Tyler's legitimate pain toward healing rather than revenge against children who bore no responsibility for his suffering. Loretta Hines became an unexpected voice in these conversations, courageously sharing her story about the warning signs she had observed but failed to act upon, urging other adults in positions of trust to speak up when they notice behavioral changes that might indicate someone is struggling with thoughts of harming others. Shadow's role transcended typical police dog heroics, representing something deeper about the partnership between human and canine instincts that had evolved over thousands of years to protect communities from threats that logic and technology might miss but animal. Senses could detect through channels that science was only beginning to understand. The German Shepherd continued his regular duties with characteristic professionalism, seemingly unaware that his Monday morning bark had transformed him into a symbol of vigilance and protection that would influence school safety protocols and canine training programs across the entire nation. Within weeks of the Willow Creek incident, school districts across New York State began implementing new protocols that elevated canine units from occasional visitors to regular participants in comprehensive safety programs designed to detect threats that human administrators might overlook in their daily focus on educational objectives and bureaucratic responsibilities. Shadow found himself at the center of a revolution in school security, thinking as law enforcement agencies recognized that his success had demonstrated capabilities far beyond traditional drug detection, revealing that properly trained police dogs could serve as early warning systems for psychological threats that manifested through behavioral and chemical changes invisible to human observation. The Pause for Safety program emerged from collaborative efforts between educators, mental health professionals, and canine specialists who understood that preventing tragedies required addressing root causes rather than simply responding to symptoms, creating frameworks where police dogs like Shadow could identify individuals whose emotional distress had reached dangerous levels before their pain transformed into active threats against innocent targets. Jake Monroe found himself traveling throughout the region, conducting training seminars for other canine handlers, sharing techniques for recognizing the subtle behavioral changes that indicated when their partners had detected something beyond drugs or weapons, something more complex and dangerous that required immediate attention even when no obvious threat was visible to human investigators. The psychological evaluation process for school employees underwent significant reforms as districts implemented more comprehensive screening procedures designed to identify individuals whose personal trauma might make them unsuitable for positions involving access to children, while also providing support resources for workers struggling with mental health challenges that could be addressed through intervention rather than termination. Shadow's story reached national media attention when major networks featured segments about the extraordinary bond between police officers and their canine partners, highlighting scientific research that explained how dogs could detect emotional distress through scent molecules released during psychological crisis, providing early warning systems that no human technology could replicate with similar accuracy and reliability. Educational conferences began featuring presentations about the role of canine units in creating safer school environments, with Shadow serving as a living example of how animal instincts could complement human intelligence in protecting vulnerable populations from threats that emerged from within trusted institutions rather than from external sources that traditional security measures were designed to address. The ripple effects extended beyond immediate safety concerns as mental health advocates used Tyler's case to illustrate the importance of early intervention programs that could redirect legitimate psychological pain toward healing rather than revenge, emphasizing that preventing tragedies required communities to address isolation and hopelessness before they metastasized into active threats against innocent individuals who happened to be accessible targets for displaced rage and resentment. 6 months after his life-saving intervention at Willow Creek Elementary, Shadow had become something unprecedented in law enforcement history, a canine officer whose single bark had triggered systemic changes in school safety protocols, while simultaneously inspiring a national conversation about the extraordinary partnership between human and canine intelligence in protecting society's most vulnerable members from threats that emerged from unexpected sources within trusted institutions. The German Shepherd continued his regular patrol duties with characteristic professionalism, unaware that his instinctive response to contaminated food had transformed him into a symbol of vigilance, whose story was being shared in police academies, veterinary schools, and educational conferences as an example of how animal senses could detect dangers that sophisticated human systems completely missed. Jake Monroe received commendations from multiple law enforcement agencies, while Shadow was honored with a specially designed medal, recognizing his role in preventing what investigators confirmed would have been a mass casualty event affecting dozens of children with severe food allergies who had been specifically targeted by Tyler's calculated revenge against a world that had made him feel invisible and powerless. The psychological aftermath of the incident continued to reverberate through the community as parents, teachers, and administrators grappled with the sobering reality that threats to children could emerge from within the very institutions designed to protect them, while also celebrating the miraculous intervention that had prevented their worst nightmares from becoming devastating reality. Tyler Hines received a sentence that balanced punishment with mental health treatment, serving as a stark reminder that personal trauma, when left untreated, could transform victims into perpetrators who targeted innocent individuals as proxies for their rage against systems and circumstances beyond their control. Loretta Hines became an advocate for mental health awareness in workplace environments, sharing her story about the warning signs she had observed but failed to act upon, urging supervisors and co-workers to speak up when they noticed behavioral changes that might indicate someone was struggling with thoughts of harming others. The cafeteria at Willow Creek Elementary was completely renovated with new safety protocols, enhanced screening procedures for all food service personnel, and a permanent memorial plaque honoring Shadow's intervention, serving as a daily reminder that heroism often comes in unexpected forms and that paying attention to subtle warnings can literally mean the difference between tragedy and triumph. Shadow's training techniques were studied and replicated by K-9 units across the country as handlers learned to recognize when their partners detected psychological distress rather than traditional contraband, expanding the role of police dogs from reactive enforcement tools to proactive community protection resources capable of identifying threats before they fully materialized into criminal actions. Shadow's heroic intervention at Willow Creek Elementary represented just one example of the extraordinary capabilities that K-9 officers demonstrate daily across America, their superhuman senses detecting threats and saving lives in ways that human technology and intuition simply cannot match, creating an invisible network of four-legged guardians whose stories rarely receive the recognition they deserve, but whose impact on public safety extends far beyond what most people realize. In Houston, Texas, a Belgian Malinois named Rex detected traces of explosives in a high school locker 3 days before prom, leading to the discovery of a detailed plot by an expelled student who had planned to detonate a device during the dance that would have killed dozens of teenagers celebrating what should have been one of the happiest nights of their young lives. The detection came not from any visible evidence, but from Rex's ability to smell chemical residues that had been transferred to the locker through innocent contact, demonstrating how K-9 senses operate on molecular levels that surpass even the most sophisticated human detection equipment currently available to law enforcement agencies. Meanwhile, in Colorado, a golden retriever cross named Luna, working with the Boulder County Sheriff's Department, alerted handlers to a school janitor whose behavior had triggered her protective instincts during a routine safety demonstration, leading to the discovery that he had been photographing children in restrooms and collecting personal information for purposes that investigators preferred not to discuss in detail, but which would have resulted in horrific consequences if Luna's intervention hadn't exposed his activities before he escalated to physical contact. These stories multiply across every state where K-9 units operate, creating a tapestry of prevented tragedies that never make headlines because the threats were neutralized before they could materialize into the kind of mass casualty, events that dominate news cycles and haunt communities for generations afterward. In Florida, a German shepherd named Thor detected emotional distress in a substitute teacher whose psychological breakdown was developing toward violent expression, while in Oregon, a Labrador named Scout identified a cafeteria worker who had been gradually increasing contamination levels in food preparation areas as part of a revenge plot against administrators who had disciplined him for previous safety violations. The scientific explanation for these extraordinary capabilities lies in the canine olfactory system, which contains over 300 million scent receptors compared to humans' mere 6 million, allowing dogs to detect chemical changes that occur when people experience intense emotional states, including the specific neurochemical signatures associated with planning violence or harboring intentions to harm innocent individuals. These detection abilities extend beyond immediate threats to include early warning systems for individuals whose psychological distress might eventually develop into dangerous behavior, providing opportunities for intervention and treatment before legitimate pain transforms into calculated revenge against targets who happen to be accessible rather than responsible for the underlying trauma driving destructive impulses. As Shadow continues his patrol duties through the quiet streets of suburban America, his dark eyes scanning environments that most humans perceive as perfectly safe and routine, we're left with profound questions about the nature of intuition, protection, and the mysterious bond between human and canine consciousness that has evolved over thousands of years to create partnerships capable of detecting evil before it fully manifests into action. The German Shepherd's intervention at Willow Creek Elementary transcended simple police work, representing something deeper about the ways that animal instincts can perceive threats that human logic and technology completely miss, operating through sensory channels that science is only beginning to understand, but which may hold keys to preventing tragedies that our sophisticated security systems fail to anticipate or address. What remains most unsettling about Tyler Hines' attempted mass poisoning is not just what he almost accomplished, but how easily his plan might have succeeded if Shadow hadn't been present that Monday morning, raising disturbing questions about how many similar threats might be developing in schools, workplaces, and communities across America, where no four-legged guardian stands ready to detect the invisible warning signs that precede calculated violence against innocent targets. The ripple effects of Shadow's bark continue to spread through educational systems, law enforcement agencies, and mental health organizations as professionals grapple with the sobering reality that preventing tragedies requires not just better security measures but deeper understanding of the psychological factors that transform ordinary individuals into threats against their own communities. Perhaps most mysteriously, Shadow himself seems completely unaware of his heroic status, approaching each new day with the same professional dedication and calm alertness that characterized his behavior before he became a national symbol of canine heroism, suggesting that his life-saving intervention represented not exceptional performance, but simply the natural expression of instincts and training that thousands of other canine officers carry within them every day. The question that haunts investigators, educators, and parents alike is whether Shadow's success was the result of extraordinary luck, superior training, or something more fundamental about the partnership between human and canine intelligence that we've barely begun to explore, let alone fully understand or systematically implement across the institutions where our children spend their most vulnerable hours. As communities nationwide reassess their safety protocols and expand canine programs beyond traditional drug detection, Shadow's story serves as both inspiration and warning, demonstrating that heroism often comes in unexpected forms while reminding us that the greatest threats to innocence may emerge not from obvious enemies, but from broken individuals whose pain has transformed into something monstrous and directed toward targets who bear no responsibility for their suffering but happen to be accessible when rage finally demands expression through violence against the defenseless. And you, what did you think about this story? Tell us in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next videos.